So they then uproot themselves. And to recreate home, they become strangers in a new land. Now, skipping over the details, particularly compared to the Irish early on, German Scandinavians tend to be fairly successful. They do, for the most part, succeed, and there are even places in Minnesota that maintain German language into the 1950s. So some of this radical conservatism succeeds, but for the most part, this is really a successful. The German migration stream is really a successful story of assimilation. There is, while you might still find evidence of Irish, that's probably too strong a statement to say that there's no such thing as an ethnic German American, but it's pretty dilute. On St. Patrick's Day, you can find lots of people that claim Irish heritage. There's just not a lot of Germans are in many ways invisible that way. Let's move ahead of this. Yes. Yeah, that's a pretty good point, and we'll see that. It's really World War I that does away with with German culture but it's still that assimilation process, that 2 or 3 generation process, is definitely at work. And while German Americans became fairly invisible, fairly deliberately during World War I, the writing was on the wall. So there was already very much in decline by then, despite being the largest ethnic group at the time. Okay, let's move on then to the Irish. We're going to spend a little more time on the Irish later on because their story is more complicated. But I do want to introduce it now and to contrast it with the Germans who are arriving at roughly the same time. Main points here are that the Irish were less welcome than the Germans or the Scandinavian immigrants. They came generally, especially during the famine years, they were poorer. Generally, they were less educated, and they were, for most of the century, more Catholic. And none of those things endeared them much especially to New Englanders, and that's where most of the Irish migration arrived. While the Germans were well positioned to take advantage of the growing 19th century, the Irish had to struggle to make a place for themselves in urban America. They ultimately succeed, but the consequences for Black Americans are significant and important. Okay, so we'll start by talking first a little bit about the pre-famine, famine, and post-famine migrations. Then I want to talk in some detail about the concept of exile as a way of describing the Irish-American mindset, how the Irish saw themselves. We'll compare that in our mind to how Duden saw the German migration. We probably don't have time for these other ideas. We'll probably get to later. Okay, so first, here's the Irish migration. It looks fairly similar actually to the German one that we saw before. That's not surprising. You saw the two lined up; they move very much in parallel. The difference, though, is this huge spike here, which is what? Famine, very much so. In the late 40s and early 50s, there's a huge famine in Ireland that, together with death and migration, together reduced the Irish population by perhaps as much as a half. Ireland today does not have the population that it had in 1845, and I don't think that's true of any other European country. Like the German migration, the Irish migration in the 19th century is really a continuation. There was some Irish migration as well, even during the colonial period, but it changes quite a lot because Ireland is complicated. Before the revolution, the majority of the so-called Irish that were migrating were what were later called Scots-Irish. That is, they were largely Protestants who had been sent to Ireland to help oppress the Catholic Irish for various reasons. Beginning after the Napoleonic Wars, the Irish Catholics begin to migrate, and by the time we get to the famine years, we're talking vast majority of the migrants are Catholic, and then beyond, it's also true. And that Catholicism is hugely important. Now, to get a sense of how the Irish saw it, I want to talk for a moment about what is called the American Wake. This is I guess a ceremony, what you call it. This is something that's not seen outside of Ireland, and it's a party, and as the name suggests, it's also a wake, in the sense that there's a connection in the minds of the Irish between immigration and death. This is something you do when your friend or relative were going to migrate, and you get together and you drink and tell stories and sing songs and read particularly unpleasant poems. I have a modest example. Tell him, since he went away, how bitter was her lot, and the landlord came one winter's night and turned us from our cot. Our troubles, they were many, and our friends, they were but few. And brother dear, our mother used oft times to talk of you, saying, darling son, come back again, she often used to say, till at last one day she sickened, aye, and soon was laid away. Her grave I watered with my tears, it's where these flowers grew. This is all I've got now, and them I send to you. It may not be great poetry, but what it lacks in nuance, it really makes up for in guilt. Right? One could see emigration, as a heroic journey, right? As an attempt to better one's lot and perhaps help one's family. That is not the way the Irish migrants saw it. They saw it as exile. That would be the term, as we'll see later, that's the term that they used. So exile with extra baggage, because exile and desertion at the same time, as that poem points out. But from the point of view of the person leaving, they would interpret their departure as forced upon them by the British. I'm sorry, to the British, I meant the English, of course. Not an expression of their individual ambition. They did not see themselves in the Ravenstein terms as pole migrants, but very much as push migrants. Right? So why were the Irish so pissed off? Um, okay, well, with our last few minutes, let us digress a moment on Irish history. I think we've alluded to some of these things before, but Ireland is different, is an entirely different culture from England. They are Irish. The Irish are descendants of Celts rather than Angles and Saxons. Their language is different, and their histories are different. Ireland did not develop a king, for example, or royalty of their own. There is no, as far as I know, no historical king of Ireland before the Tudors decided that they were kings of Ireland as well as England and Wales. So the Irish then were, compared to the English, very much disorganized, and they were easy prey. Now, when the Tudors asserted their claim of kinship, they were also, of course, busy with the Protestant Reformation in England, and that Protestant Reformation did not catch on in Ireland for various reasons. So, even though the two realms are governed as by the same king, they grow very much apart, and that difference is very unfortunate for the Irish, because it means that that over the period, I think we've talked at some length about why the English hate Catholics from all various plots and wars that they fought over religion. So naturally, there's animosity then between the English and the Irish, but that makes the Irish a natural ally of first Spain and then France, who are the natural enemies of England. Recall all those wars that the English fought in the 1700s with mostly the French. Every time the English went to war with the French, the Irish tried to get the French to invade Ireland, help them overthrow England. They never got the French to send a serious force, but they did get help from the French quite routinely. And every time, whether they got help or not, every time the Irish rose up the oppression, the English would crush them and oppress them more and more each time. By 1778, there were penal laws in place in Ireland that prohibited all Irish people from doing all of these things: owning a gun, receiving a Catholic education, entering a profession, holding a public office, engaging in trade or commerce, living within 5 miles of a corporate town, voting, receiving gift or inheritance from Protestant, and on and on and on. Sending children abroad for education. The result here is that by 1778, only 5% of the land in Ireland was owned by the Irish. The rest was owned by English of some form or another. Mostly absentee English landowners. What that sets up, I think, is the central irony of this story of the next couple of lectures. There's some debate over whether the Irish were actually even considered white on arrival. I think they were. They certainly were for naturalization purposes. But we'll see some cartoons later that suggest that some people might not have agreed. I will argue, according to Theodore Allen, at least according to Theodore Allen's definition, that the Irish were racially oppressed. That these penal laws were, in one narrow sense, racial. And that's because all Catholics were inferior to all Protestants. And the difference, if you want, is to consider what the English were doing in India at the time. In India, while there certainly is racial and caste oppression going on, the English elevated some Indians to positions of authority. They didn't do that at all in Ireland. In Ireland, they sent the Scots-Irish, the Presbyterians there to hold all those positions. And Catholics were entirely inferior. That whether you accept that argument or not isn't really critical. But the point is that the Irish were seriously oppressed. And so were who else? American blacks. And that gave at least Irish in Ireland a very strong affinity for the abolitionists. Ireland is very strongly abolitionist in this period. And it's a live issue in Ireland, even though Ireland doesn't have slaves, because other British colonies do have slaves. Remember, the British have lots of possessions in the Caribbean that are growing sugar at this time. So abolitionism happens in England before it happens in the United States. And the English, miraculously, by some accounts miraculously, abolished slavery in 1833. So we're talking about a period when this is very much an issue. And the Irish in Ireland are very much with the slave. They're very much on the abolitionist side. But the Irish in America are not. In America, the Irish are instantly in labor competition with blacks. In particular, the competition is particularly strong in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia area, with a free black population. Philadelphia has a big free black population because it's located near the South. And as the Irish arrive, they tend to be poor. They tend to compete not only with the free blacks, as I said, but also even in some cases with slaves, because there's an infamous example of the New Orleans Canal where they used Irish workers because it was too dangerous to use slaves, and slaves are valuable property. Right? But employed Irishmen are not. So the situation is very different. It's seen very differently from the Irish in the United States. Irish quickly began to organize. They have a long history of secret societies in Ireland. One of the ways that the Irish could fight back was with secret societies. You couldn't do anything publicly. But these societies were not shy of using violence. In the earliest parts of the decade of the century, the Irish would certainly fight anybody for jobs. They would fight even other Irishmen. But fairly soon, it becomes focused on blacks, and their method of operating is that they would get jobs, for example, unloading ships, and then when there were enough Irishmen working, they would simply refuse to work with blacks, and the proprietor would have to decide, and he would usually decide to hire the Irish and not the blacks. Eventually, the Irish become, in quotes, white. There's a book called How the Irish Became White that outlines this story. But another quote from Frederick Douglass, I think, also sums it up and puts it very nicely. Every hour sees us elbowed. Us, Frederick Douglass, for those who may not recall. Frederick Douglass is a leading voice of the abolitionist movement. He is an escaped slave and very articulate guy. Every hour sees us elbowed out of some employment to make room for some newly arrived immigrant from the Emerald Island, whose hunger and color entitle him to special favor. These white men are becoming house servants, cooks, stewards, waiters, and flunkies. For aught I see, they adjust themselves to their stations with all proper humility. If they cannot rise to the dignity of white men, they show they can fall to the degradation of black men. There's irony here, because by the 1850s, of course, the Irish have very much risen much closer to the dignity of white men. So, in conclusion, this bit, the story, and we'll go into more detail about it soon, because it touches on other aspects of America's development in the 19th century. The Irish success at becoming part of the mainstream is not a triumph over prejudice, but in many ways a triumph of prejudice. They're not the last immigrant group to manage this kind of transition, but they are the first, and they're well documented. So we will go into this more after the midterm. So that's all the stuff at this point that's fair game for the midterm. On Wednesday, I'm going to talk about the lab. I know that your minds will be elsewhere, but perhaps some will sink in nonetheless. And on Friday we'll have a midterm. Okay, thanks.